So, today in episode 9, I'm chatting with Dr. Elizabeth Pope, who is Associate Professor of Educational Research and also Interim Director of Research Compliance at the University of West Georgia. I've known Dr. Pope for almost a decade now, and we met through our mutual interest in the use of digital tools to enact methods, working together closely when writing up her use of qualitative software to do her dissertation literature review, which features in my 5-level QDA textbooks and instructional videos. In this episode, we start off there, actually, with how Elizabeth used ATLAS.ti and other tools for her dissertation on interfaith dialogue. And we discuss combining manual methods with electronic working, and also how she has evolved in her thinking about the use of software over the years, as the tools themselves have evolved. This includes Elizabeth's belief in emphasising the importance that individual researchers use tools in ways that work for them, rather than being prescriptive in how they should be harnessed. This discussion leads on to broader reflections on the teaching and learning of qualitative methods and tools. In particular, we spend some time chatting about Elizabeth's interest in reflexivity as the cornerstone to qualitative methods. This relates to discussions about differences and tensions between qualitative and quantitative research mindsets and how she handles those in her teaching. Dr. Pope also shares some of her experiences with working collaboratively, using the web version of ATLAS.ti, and also the importance of documenting process and being organised amongst the team. She also discusses a recent project she's been involved in, where instead of doing any coding, they wrote a series of more and more detailed memos. We then go on to discuss Elizabeth's work with the World Conference on Qualitative Research and working as publications coordinator for the journal New Trends in Qualitative Research that comes out of the conference. And that gets us on to reflect about the importance of open, collegiate and supportive conference environments and the subtle difference between being intellectually challenged and tested in those spaces. And of course, we chat about one of the hot topics of the moment, the use of AI for qualitative analysis. And Elizabeth reflects on what AI is good at, how it can contribute usefully to the qualitative research process, and also what it just isn't good at, and why we should also be cautious. And she emphasises the importance of disclosure if using AI and being proactive rather than reactive, which circles us all the way back to issues of quality and rigour and reflexivity, and Elizabeth's roots in learning about and researching religion. So, a pretty wide-ranging chat we had, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Okay, so hi, thanks so much for taking the time to have a chat with me today, Liz. It's great to hook up again.
It's great to be here.
So I thought we'd start off kind of with a little bit about your research background, and I guess one place to start off is your PhD research on interfaith dialogue, and that's around the time you were doing that was when we first met, actually. I think about 10 years ago, something like that, is it?
Yeah, maybe 9.
Maybe
It was
9, yeah.
ICQI.
Yeah, time goes by fast, doesn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about your PhD research, what it was about, and what kind of methods you used?
Sure. So I have 2 degrees in religion, and all of my degrees are from the University of Georgia, so what they call it, a triple dog. And I graduated in 2011 with my master's in Islam, and I taught introductory research or introductory religion classes. I taught at the University of Georgia as an instructor, and I taught at Georgia Gwinnett College as an instructor. And I really liked teaching, and I really liked teaching people of one religion about another religion. I found it interesting and fun, and it was, what I liked the most about taking religion classes, because learning about these religions was so contrary to my life experience. I'm from a small town in Georgia, and so I didn't really know anybody who wasn't Christian, even though in my family we have non-Christian background, but I didn't know anybody who wasn't a practicing Christian, or just not practicing, but that, like, of another religion. And so when I realized that in order to make a career teaching in college, I probably needed a PhD. I had to think about what I wanted to do because I wanted something more practical, and that like less theoretical, more practical, not like useful, but more practical than a degree in religion. And so I talked with one of my mentors at UGA in the religion department about this, and I told her, what I really liked about teaching and seeing people's understandings and viewpoints of other religions change because they started to understand them a little better. Not necessarily like, oh, I like this religion and I'm going to follow it. Like that's not what I'm talking about, but just, oh, well, I thought X and Y is actually true. Maybe my perception of these people needs to shift a little bit. And so she asked me if I'd ever heard of transformative learning theory, and I said no. And she was like, well, you should look it up. And it's in, the field of adult education. And you should reach out to Aliki Nicolades in the department here. It's LEAP is the acronym. And of course I forget what the full name is. But my degree was in a PhD in adult education. So I met with Dr. Nicolades, who's phenomenal, in particular with transformative learning theory, and talked to her a little bit about what I wanted to do, particularly with the theory, but in the context of interfaith dialogue. And she was like, yeah, apply for the program. You get in, you can work with me, and we can figure something out. And I was like, great. And so I did. And my research has since looked at adult learning within the context of interfaith dialogue. So what did they learn? How do they learn? And is it a transformative experience or not? At the time, there was a decent, there's still not a whole lot, but there was a decent amount of literature saying that it was a transformative experience, but it didn't really break down how. And so that's really what I looked at, was like, what are the steps to transformative learning in the context of interfaith dialogue? And I like developed a little model, and I did a case study with an interfaith dialogue group who'd been meeting for, at that time, 10 years or so, of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They got together about once a month, and they met, and they talked about something that they had pulled out. They followed a model called scriptural reasoning, where you pull out scripture that is similar across 3 texts, and they talked about it, and they read it, they talked about it, they reflected on it. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? How is it different? How is it the same? What are my personal experiences with it? And things like that. And so I did observations of like the whole group. I did observations of the steering committee, which was about 9 people. I did several of those. I did probably about 5 or 6 observations of each. And I did interviews with the steering committee and interviews with the person who started the group. I collected documents, so I ended up with like a ton of data that I subsequently did reanalyze for other things. But it was just the beginning. It was fun.
Yeah, and so lots of materials, lots of qualitative materials, and I guess that's how you got into thinking about using computers to help you do that analysis. Is that right? You were using ATLAS.ti
for
that project.
I did use ATLAS.ti, but I started using it for my literature review.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I started collecting data for my dissertation, I had already been using it for a year. I did a paperless literature review. I took a data collection class with Trita Paulus, and she showed us ATLAS.ti. And I was in the midst of, I needed to start my literature review, and just the thought of having like multiple 3-inch binders of printed articles to try to organize and sift through and find what I remembered reading somewhere at some point in maybe binder 1 or maybe binder 2 just sounded awful. So I remember going to her office and being like, teach me how to use this for a lit review because I can't sift through things on paper. And I figured, hey, it's a lit review. If I completely mess it up and I end up hating this program, I can do it the other way. I'm not going to be in the midst of, trying to analyze my data for my dissertation and learning this program. I felt like it was maybe a lower stakes place to learn it. And so that's what I started.
Yeah, that's interesting. I often say to students these days, learning whichever digital tool you decide to use, whichever qualitative software, whether it's ATLAS.ti or whatever, learning it on your literature review is really good because it helps you hone not only your understanding of how the software works, but also thinking about analysis techniques. Because of course, doing a literature review, it's a form of qualitative data analysis, isn't it, itself? So it's kind of like an entry into the whole process as well as the tools. But did you end up using ATLAS.ti for your data analysis as well as your literature review then?
Oh yeah, I used it for everything. Except for I dictated notes in Evernote. I dictated like reflective memos after my observations. I did that in Evernote, but then once they were in text form, I put them in Atlas. And I wrote field notes by hand when I was doing the observations, and I wrote on the interview guides my notes by hand, but I transferred everything into Atlas. So I ended up doing pretty much everything through Atlas as far as organization and analyzation goes.
That's interesting. So I get asked lots, should you have one software project for the literature review and another one for the data separately, or did you have it integrated from the get-go?
I had two projects, but I used Atlas for both of them. I still am not very well versed in Mendeley or Zotero, even though I hear like phenomenal things about them. And every time I like watch a video, I'm like, why am I not using one of these? But I just have used Atlas for like organization and memoing and everything for lit reviews. And I have not had a project where I've fully integrated, like, document group for literature, document group for data, and da-da-da, although, I mean, I can absolutely see the advantages of that, but I just haven't done it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because everyone does slightly different things, and it's, that's one of the things I love most about all of the methods and tools. You can kind of combine methods and you can combine tools and you can go in and out of software. And, I say to people all the time, I haven't thrown away my highlighter pens. I still do some things outside of the software, but I then just transfer it back in, a bit like you've just described. Is that something that you see amongst your own students now?
Yeah, they use it to varying degrees. And I also tell them a lot of the time, like, use it how it works best for you, and then it's powerful. Feeling like you have to do it like the way that the trainer did it, or you have to do it the way that, your colleague did it, or you have to do it the way that even I do it. Like if that doesn't work for you, then that doesn't work for you. And you shouldn't try to do it that way. And I think, I agree. I think that's one of the beautiful things about it is there's so many different ways to do it that you don't have to be boxed into this is how you use the platform.
And how differently would you say you use these tools now from back then? So I know you've got a chapter in the books that Nick and I wrote on the 5-level QDA method about how you used ATLAS.ti for your literature review, and we translated that into how you could have used other tools as well, not just ATLAS.ti. So that was a real fun project. I really enjoyed kind of chatting with you about what did you actually do and why did you do it like that, and then thinking about how that would have looked, that process in NVivo or MaxQDA or whatever. But do you feel that your own process has evolved over time?
Somewhat, yeah. I think at the core, I probably do some very similar things, but I think that as the software has evolved, the way that I use the new tools has moved. So in particular, I think about Atlas has hierarchical coding now. I didn't have it then. So I had to create that hierarchical structure and how I named the codes. And now I don't have to do that. And it's wonderful. I can just drag and drop and make parent and child codes, and like it's all there. And so, that's one example of it's something that I did, but now is so much easier to capture in the software. Working with other people has been more interesting because I've used the cloud more, just for like, the early stages of things. And then I've either transferred it into the desktop, or we've, pulled analysis out and done some of the other things out of the software, which has been interesting. I just completed a project where we didn't do any coding at all. We just wrote a series of more and more detailed memos, which was fun. And we did that in the cloud as well. And it wasn't necessarily because we were like, well, the cloud platform is not going to be able to do like some of these higher level analytical techniques that the desktop can do. It was just, this is how our analysis is developing right now. We already have this series of memos. We've already written a second series, like, let's just memo. And it worked out well. We're writing the manuscript now, and I feel like it's coherent. We didn't miss anything. So
oh, that's really cool. I look forward to reading that, because I lots of people back in the day when these programs first came onto the scene, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was some people were kind of critical around how the use of software kind of homogenized the idea that we do coding, and that not all qualitative methods employ coding. And I've always been a bit resistant to that idea, because you can use codes in all kinds of different ways. It doesn't have to be for the kind of classic qualitative coding. And I've worked with many people over the years who don't code. So, it's interesting to hear you talk about that. Is that using the ATLAS.ti cloud platform? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's my first one to do it that way, but I liked it.
Yeah. And how do you find it in terms of what actually happens in an analysis when you're working in a team collaboratively, as opposed to when you're working as an individual? Because there's a whole nother layer of kind of organization. You've talked a little bit about how the tool helps you organize as much as anything else. And I just wondered what that added dimension when there's a bunch of you working together.
Yeah. So for me, a lot of it is like trying not to control, because as far as organization goes and things like that, and I think that's one reason I enjoy the process so much. I'm very focused on organization, stepwise clarity and analysis and writing. And not everybody thinks or works that way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the way that they think or work is bad. And so working in a software with other people, I think that one of the big things for me has been like, let's write memos of what we do and what needs to be done next and how we did it, so that either, when the next person, primarily with the desktop, when I send the bundle to someone, they know, let me read this first. Let me check it out, be sure that I know where we are, and how they did what they did. And so that way, if I add to it or request, like, can we edit this a little bit? Like, I have not just an understanding of what they did, but the process that they went through to do it. And I think that that's one of the nicest things, that they can write out a memo, and then like I can go in the codes and I can see who created what, when, and how. And it just, not just for trustworthiness purposes creates that audit trail, but it creates that audit trail for researchers working together and sending things back and forth. So I feel like you have to use it to facilitate communication, because you can't always just like call somebody, I just sent it to you and here's what I did and remember all this, but like, you can write it down. And when you're working alone, you can just build everything exactly the way that your little heart desires, and it doesn't matter if it makes sense to someone else in the great grand scheme of things, as long as you can pull it together and present it in a way that's clear and coherent.
Yeah. So you can learn a lot, I find, from how others, not just how others interpret the data, but how others kind of structure their workflow, if you like, which made me kind of think, you mentioned Trina Paulus earlier as the person who introduced you to the idea that you could use software to do your literature review. And whilst you were doing your PhD, you started teaching alongside her. Is that right? Is that how you got into the teaching of ATLAS.ti originally?
Yeah, so I TA'd with her, and we did a class that taught Atlas to some people using the method that y'all developed, and then we did a case study on how it went. And so I became, I think when I was working on the chapter with y'all, I was also going through the certification to be a student trainer. Um, part of, part of that was for monetary reasons. And part of that was because I liked it enough that I wanted to be able to help my other classmates and people in my program to let them know, like, from a student perspective, like, let me tell you how much this can help. And so, yeah, she kind of started me down that road to not only here you can use this, but like you can help other people who want to use it or aren't even familiar with it. And that's one thing that I tell my students, like, you don't have to use it. I'm not going to, force you to use a software, but I am going to force you to look at one and see what you think about it, because you don't even know that they're a thing, and everyone should know that they're a thing.
Yeah, that's one of my bugbears is, that there's still quite a lot of qualitative methods teaching that happens around the world where tools are not even mentioned. So
Yeah.
I'm very much like you've just alluded to, I think you can do good qualitative analysis without using software.
Yeah.
Just like you can do bad qualitative analysis using it. But like to not
Yes.
tell the students that these tools are out there, or to expose them to the idea so that they can kind of experiment and come up with their own, because it's a tool, right?
Right.
And yeah, so it's interesting to hear you say that. Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences with teaching, what you like about teaching methods and tools, or the other side of the coin, what the challenges with that might be?
Sure. So I teach at a teaching intensive institution. We're a regional comprehensive college, the University of West Georgia, and I teach in EDD programs. And often the one qualitative class that I teach is the one qualitative class that they get. And we don't have site licenses to any of these software. And so I don't actually get to teach tools as often as I would like. But I do, when we talk about interviews, I do talk about the different tools that you can use to conduct your interviews and record your interviews and transcribe your interviews, and whether that be by hand or using AI as a first round. What I like to do is, if I do a Zoom interview or any interview, I, audio record it, and then I run it through Otter AI for a base transcription. And while that's going, I write my summary memo and I pull out important quotes, and I, usually get about a 3 or 4 page memo based on what happened in the interview. And then I can go back and check the transcript for accuracy. So it's multiple rounds of not just listening, but listening and reflecting and thinking. And so one of my favorite things to do is to talk about how the tools can be used to facilitate the process. They're not necessarily like a one use kind of thing. Like I'm just going to use Zoom to conduct and record my interviews and then like I'm done with it. You can use it to facilitate parts of the process as you go along. And that, the other thing, and I think this is probably coming from some of my recent work with Trina Paulus, is that when we think about what we do when we're in field work, how we do it is going to be different depending on the tools we use, and how it impacts us and how it impacts our participants is going to be different depending on the tools we use. And so those are good conversations to have while teaching, is especially when I'm working with my dissertation students. I'm like, well, what if that doesn't work? You've got this, beautiful plan wrapped up in a bow, and then you're going to get in the field, and what if this happens, or what if that happens, and just getting them thinking through those. Oh, well, I wanted to use this tool, but what if, it has this negative consequence or this positive consequence? Like, how am I going to move forward with that? And so thinking about, I think people we're so used to having technology everywhere all around us constantly, and like it works, right? Until it doesn't work. And then you're like, oh, this isn't working. I mean, like I had to do a class earlier in the semester on my phone because my Zoom on my work computer had to update, and the way that the settings were set, I had to get someone from IT to come and update my Zoom. Like I couldn't just do it myself. So I was on my phone teaching a class because I couldn't do it on my laptop. So like that was interesting and awkward for me. And I don't know how impact like my students didn't seem that upset, but like I couldn't break them into breakout rooms. And I couldn't, do, my arm got tired holding my phone up, like I couldn't do some of the things that I do so easily on a laptop. And that, that's an unforeseen, like this wasn't me, not planning well. It was, well, it worked an hour before and then I turned my computer off. And when I turned it back on, it was like, oh, you need an update and Zoom's not going to do anything until you do this. Oh, that's great. So, that's another thing that I like when I teach the methods along with the tools, is that it can facilitate this process super well. But I also think it really underscores what we're taught in qual, or anybody doing field work, is have a backup plan, because what you're trying to do just might not work. I want to go observe this event and then the event gets canceled and you're like, well, then what do I do now? You gotta have a backup plan. So I think it really, that's another thing that I don't think people always think about in detail, but bringing in my experiences in the class helps with that.
Yeah, I wonder whether the COVID pandemic has made people think a bit more differently about that, or be a bit more aware of the need for a backup plan, maybe. I don't know.
I wonder. I mean, I definitely think it has normalized using these tools more than it did before. I mean, I drove states away to do most of my interviews, and the other ones I did like over the phone, like a Skype phone call, to make recording easy. I didn't even consider Zoom.
Yeah.
But it wasn't so long ago that Zoom existed. I just didn't know what it was. And it would have made things better than doing just a phone interview over Skype. I think it would have been nicer to see people.
So we're talking about the kind of concept of sort of technological reflexivity and the kind of consequences. So that the idea that your choice of methods and tools have consequences. And I know you've done quite a lot of work on that recently, including you've done some metasynthesis work around that topic. Is that right?
Yeah, I did that with Trina. I've done more work on reflexivity generally, but I have piggybacked on some of the things she's doing with technological reflexivity with that project.
So how important do you think reflexivity is more generally? And do we talk about it enough in qualitative methods? I guess that's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good one. I think it's integral to research in general. I don't think it's something that only qualitative researchers should be talking about. I think it's naive to think that our own self as a human being doesn't come into research. And I don't know if that's, from my background of religion and studying what people believe and putting that in the forefront and having that perspective of what you believe determines why you do what you do and what you choose to do. I don't know if it comes from that, but reflexivity and the idea of subjectivity was something that was really one of the first connectors I had to qualitative work. I remember, taking one of my first classes and learning about that, and then also learning about theory, ontology, epistemology, methodology, and being like, oh, I know these terms, we talk about this in religion, and other people being like, what on earth is this word? And it's like, oh yeah, it's this. Like, wait, let me throw some extra ones in there, like anthropology and teleology and eschatology and all this extra stuff that I learned about in religion. But I think that it underscores so much of a project. And when I taught, I don't do it very much anymore because I have a different role here, but I used to teach just intro to research courses, and we would talk about qual, quant, mixed methods, action research, kind of all those things. I always start my class with subjectivity and reflexivity. And then I talk a little bit about, the different mindsets between quantitative work and qualitative work, having objective reality that you can test versus not. But saying that, why you've chosen to do a project based on a specific topic in a certain way, and that comes from your subjective viewpoint and your experiences and understanding, what you think is important and what you think is impactful and how you think the results will be most useful to other people, and that it should be acknowledged that you cannot be completely objective because you are a human being and not a robot. And so that pretending that you are, I think, detracts from a project of any kind. And I'm not saying that quantitative researchers necessarily should go into as much detail as qualitative researchers do. But, a base acknowledgement in the beginning, I think, strengthens any project.
So what do you think about the kind of historical kind of dichotomy or paradigm wars between the qual and quant?
Part of me thinks it's hilarious that people think that they can be completely objective. Like, it's funny. But I definitely understand from the philosophical standpoint where they're coming from and why that dichotomy exists, as far as the mindset we take, the approach we take, the tools we use, how we gather our data, what data we gather. And I look at them as just different sides of the coin. I don't necessarily think that one is, so vastly different from the other that they can't be reconciled. I just say, here's a topic that we're trying to understand. How are you going to try to understand it? Which side of the coin, or the whole coin? What are you going to do? What questions are you going to ask? And that really determines the approach you should take. Not necessarily if you think that one's more valid than the other. I don't. I do qualitative work, quite frankly, because I enjoy it more. I find it more fun to actually talk to people. But I don't necessarily think that qualitative work leads to more valid or rigorous research than quantitative work. I just am not as interested in it.
And how do you feel your students come into that space? So are there some sort of embedded assumptions that they come to a methods course
Always. Always. I teach in education, and so a lot of my students are teachers or administrators or counselors, and they do a lot of work with data. Like, they're just swimming in data, and a lot of it's quantitative data. And so sometimes they come in with this mindset that, I understand quantitative research and I can't possibly understand qualitative research. But then they learn that they have, one of the big things that I try to stress is you have a lot of these skills already, because you do observations for your job and you talk to people for your job, maybe not in the qualitative research mindset. You have tons of documents that you're constantly analyzing. Let's reframe that experience. And so that helps a lot of them learn that they're not starting from a blank slate. But I find that the subjectivity and reflexivity part can often be one of the hardest. I had a student tell me, we're told to leave ourselves at the door when we come in. And I'm like, and how do you do that? And they're like, really hard. I'm like, yeah, because you can't really. You can acknowledge who you are and you can be aware of what's going to come up and, be ready for it so that it doesn't come out. But you can't ever leave yourself behind. It's an interesting mentality. And so those are kind of the main things that I noticed, that you're like, oh, well, quant we're familiar with. That's research, right? Because we have all this stuff and we're supposed to do it. And, what is qual or anything? Or some people think qual is it's just easier because you're just talking to people and then you just kind of write something up, right? And it's like, actually, no, there's a lot of processes and appropriate ways to do it that make it just as rigorous.
Do you think that sort of idea that kind of qual is kind of fluffy, sort of anecdotal, subjective, do you see that those kind of perspectives still coming through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. And that's something that we talk about kind of throughout the class, that good qual work takes a lot of work. And bad qual work is just as bad as bad quant. But that all research has norms and ways to do it so that you do it well and you do a good project, and that both qual and quant are systematic and rigorous in their processes. And so that's something that we talk about in the beginning. What are your perceptions? What do you know about qualitative research? And we kind of work through and talk about, how that changes and how we can build a coherent and high quality, rigorous project.
And I guess as a community of practice, this work that we still need to do as teachers and methodologists and researchers to kind of get that message across a bit more clearly, maybe. I don't know, my perception is historically qualitative researchers haven't always been very good at communicating that, and that maybe tools help to make it more concrete because we can illustrate the processes we've been through, more concretely when we can take screenshots or exports or show people around our projects. My very first qualitative project, it was all bits of paper all over the place, and and there's nothing wrong with working like that, and many people still do, but it's very difficult when you work manually like that to actually robustly illustrate what you've done. Yeah. And so I always wonder how, those of us who do use tools, maybe we have a responsibility that we haven't necessarily taken up to the fullest degree to communicate that a bit more clearly. I think many of us have tried along the way, but I don't know whether that's still something that's an issue in the field.
It's possible. It makes me think of the movie with the serial killer who's got the bulletin board and the string and all the papers everywhere. And I think that people, have this may have this perception that, qualitative work is so subjective. Like, how do you prove anything, right? And so, one of the big things that I remind my students is that we always go back to the data, and we don't pull the data out of context, like as much as that's why I really don't like it when people use Excel to code. It drives me like, so you cut and paste like the data out of context into this cell and put it in a table. It's one of my least favorite ways to analyze qualitative data, because I just feel like my job as the researcher is to understand their experience in the context in which they describe it about the phenomenon I'm looking for. And it's not about me. And that's something that when I taught religion, I got on my evaluations all the time was, well, I don't know what she believes. And I'm like, good, because it's not about me. And that's how I feel about research. It's not about me. What, my beliefs and my subjectivities, they come to light, and I've spent a lot of time looking at them and understanding what they are, particularly because I do research around religion, which is a very sensitive topic. And there are things people tell me in interviews that I'm like, personally, I kind of want to vomit right now. But like, that's not the point. That's not why I'm there. I'm there to learn from their experiences. And so, I tell my students, like, it all goes back to the data and what your participants said and the context in which they said it. And it's your job to present it in that way. And that's another reason why member checking is so important. And it's not just sending your participant the transcript and is this what you said? It's the next steps. Like, that's good member checking to me is like, let's have a conversation about this page of preliminary notes that I sent you and see if you think this matches what you talked about. I often do focus groups for my member checking, and I record it and have another round of analysis afterward. And so that's, to me, when I get asked, well, this is also subjective. Like, how do I make it valid? It's like, well, first off, let's switch our thinking around from quantitative validity to the other ideas we talked about in the class. And then remember that it all comes back to the data.
But there's an interesting balance, isn't there? I wouldn't say tension, but a balance between the reflexivity piece and thinking about our role as an instrument in the interpretation and how all of our background, context, etc., affects the way we interpret data, but then also maintaining the voice of the participants as well. And that's a balance that's really important to achieve, but quite tricky to achieve. Opening up more discussion around that in the sense that you're saying you do with your students is really, really important in terms of the methodological trustworthiness of qualitative methods.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, can we move on? Because this makes me think a little bit, these discussions about your work with the World Conference on Qualitative Research, which is one, those kinds of platforms are one way that we as qualitative researchers, teachers, methodologists can discuss these kind of issues in a kind of global and multidisciplinary context. So can you talk a little bit about your work with them and what it's like participating in those conference sessions?
Sure. So the World Conference on Qualitative Research is a kind of newer conference. I actually met Antonio Pedro Costa at it was IIQM at the time. I think it's just the Qualitative Methods Conference now, out of the University of Alberta in Banff, and started my work with WCQR after that meeting. And I have attended and presented mostly virtually, one due to COVID, and two due to just having young children and being able to travel, just not working out. For most of it, I've been trying to get them to have a conference in the US, and so we'll see how that goes. But the conference, I think, is a really great space. I think it's very open to generating new ideas and discussing some of these methodological concepts. But I also think it's a really good space for novice and student researchers. I find it, there are very few conferences that I've been to that I think are bad spaces for students or novice researchers, but I think this one's particularly good because, I mean, every time I've been there, people have been very open and very, generative and willing to build ideas. And, there's always someone there that I think connects to a variety of ideas. And that's one of my favorite things about WCQR is it's qualitative research in so many different contexts, but across the globe. And so, I really like International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, but I feel like WCQR is more global, but it also has, I think, more of a European and African context than a US context. And so now I've edited a couple of the journals with them, New Trends in Qualitative Research, which are open access, which is great. And now I'm the publications coordinator for them. And so I'm kind of coordinating the editing of several special issues. I'm not the editor for any of them, but I'm facilitating and coordinating. And so that's been fun, seeing the manuscripts that come in. And it's a good space. I like it. And I'm interested to see how it grows.
Absolutely. So they're pretty prolific in terms of the outputs that they generate from the conference and other things along the way, aren't they? I think I went to the first, before it became WCQR, it had a different, I think it was called the International Qualitative Symposium or something like that. And then it turned into WQCR a few years ago. But they're doing it every year, and now they're doing it both hybrid and in person, so it's kind of got both angles. So there's so many interesting sessions I've been to, and it's interesting to hear your perspective on how open it is to not just the global and the multidisciplinary, but the different stages of career that people might be at. And I value as much hearing from students who are kind of really nervous doing their first I think that's just as enlightening to those of us who've been around for a bit longer as listening to the old generation who have been around for decades, who also bring something. But it's really collegiate in that sense, isn't it? And and the idea that we all have something to contribute, whatever stage of our career we're in, or wherever in the world we're working, or whatever method we're using, or whatever discipline we're in. And I really like that kind of
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. I find it as it's an engaging and supportive atmosphere, which I like in a conference. That's what I want. I don't want to feel tested. Not to say I don't want to be challenged, because I do want it to be a challenging and intellectual experience as well, but that goes with the engaging aspect and then supportive. So it's good. I like it.
It's interesting. I like that idea, the difference between being challenged and tested. There's a subtle
Yeah,
difference, but it
it
may be a
is.
really important one. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And I think, my very first conference as a graduate student was in Santa Barbara about a specific scholar that I was using for my thesis work. And it was a graduate student led conference, and it was awesome. And I think, I wonder how different my experience in scholarship would be if my first conference experience was not awesome. I think it would have been a lot different.
Okay, you mentioned robots earlier.
Okay.
I think you said the word robot, but you definitely mentioned the idea of AI.
Oh,
And
yeah.
obviously in the last 18 months or so, that has kind of exploded into our qualitative space, along with most spaces.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have a little bit of a chat about your thoughts on that, in terms of the rise of generative AI, specifically, what your thoughts are on how researchers are responding to that in terms of qualitative analysis, and your thoughts on the impact it's going to have, or is already having, on research
Yeah.
practice and methods.
Yeah. So, I think there's the two camps, right? There's the wow, this can change so much, and let's see what it can do for us. And there's the, wow, this can change so much, keep it at arm's length and pretend it's not there, or hope that it'll go away. And, my husband is in computer engineering, and he's talks about the development of generative AI. And he also has a history degree, and, seeing, he's like, there's no way it's just not good enough to write a history paper in a coherent and good way. You can tell. And then other things that it does very, very well. And so that's an interesting thing to think about is, well, what does it do well and what does it not do well? And, to me as a researcher, I have not used it very often, not used the generative AI capabilities in ATLAS.ti. I use it for transcription, but that has to be checked. And I've used Otter, I've used Zoom, and I used to transcribe by hand. And the thought of I fully support the transcriptions of first aids analysis, but I also fully support that you're going to have to go back and check it regardless. So getting that first go around from generative AI does not bother me at all, because you're going to have to go back and check it. And I just think that while there is a lot that it's doing for research, I think about sentiment analysis and auto coding and some of these things that the QDOS have. I also think it's got a long way to go before researchers are obsolete, as the fear is, right? We're all going to lose our jobs and we're going to be obsolete because the computers are going to do it for us. And I'm like, maybe, but that will be a while, because I've seen what it can do, and it can do a lot, but it's not a person, and it can't look at it in the way that we do. So I think, to me, it's a really good first pass on a lot of things. It's a way to, get a snapshot of some of these things. And I've played around with it. Some of these things that Atlas thinks are positive or negative comments, I've gone through them and I'm like, well, why is that positive? There's nothing particularly positive about that or negative. It's just kind of a comment. And, auto coding to find a concept, I think is very helpful. And then you as a researcher go through that. But, ultimately I'm like, well, would I use auto coding or just search and find? I don't know. So I think if it's used well, it can start off the facilitation of a really great project. But if that is how people think that they're going to be able to analyze their data, I think they're sorely misinformed.
So we have a responsibility as teachers in that respect then, don't we? So, I've heard quite a lot of people be really concerned about the idea that, oh, everybody's using it and they're just using it without critical thinking and like,
Yeah.
And so what role do we have as teachers of methods in that space? Have you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think our role is to recognize it and to talk about what it can and can't do and how to use it in a research project. I think it's naive of us as teachers to pretend like we're not going to use it or they're not going to use it or someone shouldn't use it. And I think that sweeping it under the rug or not recognizing it doesn't help anybody. I think it's our job to say, here's what it is, here's what it can do, here's what it can't do. And just like any other tool in the suite, talk about how it can be used to facilitate a powerful project, because it can. And some people may be like, yeah, I'm going to use this. And some people may think, that doesn't fit with what I need. I mean, like, I don't need to use sentiment analysis, so I don't. Not because I have anything wrong with the concept of using AI to pull that stuff out, but just because it doesn't help me in a project that I've done so far. But it may help somebody else, and I may show it to somebody and they may say that is the best thing ever invented. So I think it's our job to recognize what it can and can't do and the way that we have educated ourselves to figure out, and not just go on personal preference and belief.
So that makes me think about kind of research integrity and which are a few things that we've talked about already today in terms of trustworthiness. But I know you've got a current role in the space of research compliance, and I wonder how this whole generative AI feeds into that and what the kind of broader perspective in universities is around these kinds of things at the moment.
Yeah, I do. So I am also the interim director of research compliance at West Georgia, which really boils down to I am in charge of all things IRB here at West Georgia. And as far, it's interesting in the research methods world, qualitatively, generative AI is a big conversation. But there are conversations about ethics in and generative AI with like City Training Organization and OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protections with the US, the HHS, Office of Health and Human Services. And so they talk about it from an ethics standpoint, but as far as the nitty gritty of research compliance, I haven't seen a whole lot about it, but I'm very new in this role and I have not, had a lot of time to do the research that I need to. But, there is that question of, when I think about like fabrication and falsification of data, and not that, AI leads to that necessarily, but it can. And so this just, to me, always comes back to disclosure. I did this and I used it in this way, as far as both research integrity, research ethics, and for validity and reliability or quality and rigor, depending on what side of the coin you're on. And so, understanding what it can and can't do, and then disclosing how you used it and why, I think is becoming even more integral to a research project than it was before. And I don't know. I mean, I think that would be an interesting research project, like an interesting metasynthesis is, are people disclosing their use of AI? And if so, how? Is there so much fear that surrounds, like, I used AI, I'm going to get charged with blah, blah, blah. You think about students and writing entire papers with AI, and a lot of universities right now don't have a specific policy to like, unless they admit it, you can't really prove it. Other than, I mean, some of them it's like, well, this is just really bad, so like, good try, but you should have just written this yourself.
It seems to me that it's really different around the world and in different institutions. So I know that some universities have kind of got a blanket no AI is allowed at all, and others have already developed policies around what is and isn't appropriate and how we ought to talk about this, and others are kind of sort of hiding from it, it seems, or just kind of like haven't worked out what to do yet.
Definitely.
And so I think it's going to take a while, isn't it, to settle down. And I don't know what we need to do as a community of qualitative methodologists to kind of hasten or kind of provide spaces where we can talk about this in kind of open ways that are actually useful to us as a community of practice, because there's potentially really important impacts on what's going to happen, because the technology is, in the last 18 months already, it's kind of blown up in terms of what's possible. And like in 5 years' time, what's possible is going to be completely different. And I don't know where the spaces are for us to discuss that in a way that is useful for our purposes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I agree. I mean, I think it all comes back to transparency, really, and not hiding from it, being proactive rather than reactive, recognizing that there are positives as well as negatives. But I don't know, everything changes, right? Like nothing stays the same ever. And this is one of those things with technology that's just changing so drastically. And I just feel like even if I choose not to use it, I have a responsibility to understand it at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think what you said earlier about, the idea about being transparent about what you did, why you did it, how you did it, that's also an opportunity to kind of raise the discussion around transparency more, because I think, even before generative AI, there was an issue around transparency and qualitative methods anyway. So I'm also thinking about how we can see this as an opportunity to raise the stakes in terms of those sorts of things as well, which is something that hasn't necessarily always happened everywhere.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that goes back to your earlier point of people, misunderstanding qual and thinking it's that fluffy, fuzzy side of things. And part of it comes from, people weren't very transparent in the systematic process that they used to develop what they developed. And if they had been, it might have helped that. But, I was trained to be very transparent, and write things out in a stepwise process and, have exactly what I've done. And so it's interesting to me, when I read a report and I'm, the methods, it's like a page and I'm like, well, but how did you do that?
I always go straight to the methods section first. Because I kind of need to trust the methods before I can kind of look at the findings and trust those. I don't know, but there's never enough space, is there, in one journal article to talk about both of the things?
No, there's not. But that's why you write a methodological piece, right?
Indeed. And publish that first so that your substantive piece can refer back to it.
Can refer to it, exactly.
Yeah. Methods, see previous paper.
Exactly. You have 2 sentences. See this paper. I already wrote it out.
All right, we're coming sort of to round up a little bit, but before we get to the final 2 questions that I'm asking everyone, that I know that you know what I'm going to ask you, but I just wanted to ask you something else, a little sneaky question, which I haven't prepared you for. It's like, I wonder where you would love to go in your career. So like, I don't know, 5-10 years in the future, what would you love to be doing if all kind of barriers were out of the way?
Yeah. Oh, that is an interesting question. I love the work that I'm doing on reflexivity. I really do. And I really want to continue working on writing and researching about not just like what reflexivity is, but how to be reflexive and how to teach other people to be reflexive. And I think that it overlaps in a lot of the areas, the other research content areas that I have done. And because, thinking about learning about religion is, it's often learning about the self, and how we do that really determines a lot about who we are in our lives and how we move forward in life. And how we engage with other people. And so that's where I really want to be able to focus my efforts, find some way to focus in that way and really help expand the body of literature and practical application of learning about the self, whether it be in the research context or, you know, learning about the self so that you can engage with people who think and behave differently from you in a way where you don't feel threatened or they don't feel threatened, and it can lead to a positive experience. I think that would be where I'd like to be.
That's really interesting, because when you were telling me earlier about, you know, how you got into your PhD topic from, you know, your personal experiences in your family, that's not dissimilar from one of the reasons that I did my PhD on my topic. So I looked at how young people in 2 different countries learn about sex and relationships from different places in their lives. And the 2 countries was my father's country, England, and where my mother grew up and was born, the Netherlands. And so one of the reasons I looked at those 2 countries wasn't just because there were some differences in policies and educational and histories, but also because I wanted to use my PhD partly as a way to understand myself a little bit more.
Yeah.
And when you were telling me about how you got into your PhD, I thought, oh, you know, that's not dissimilar. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how we can use our research as a way of understanding ourselves, and how that kind of resonates with the ideas of reflexivity that you've talked about, and how it's all kind of intertwined. And strikes me how many people I meet and chat to who came to qualitative research in some way or other through a personal experience like that.
Yeah, I don't think that's unique at all. And I also think that a lot of quantitative researchers choose a topic for a very similar reason.
Yeah.
Whether they recognize it or not, or are trained to recognize it or not, I think is another question. But I think that more often than not, that's what leads to it. I think it would be rare for somebody to choose a topic that they had no personal or professional connection with at all.
All right, then let's move on to those final 2 questions.
Oh,
that, as you know, I ask everybody in these podcasts. So if you if you had to pinpoint one moment in the past 30 odd years, or however many years, that had changed the course of computer assisted qualitative analysis, what would that be?
Well, so I've only been doing this for, 9 years. So I can't go back that far. And for me, it's got to be this generative AI conversation that I think is really shaking things up and making people think about computer assisted qualitative data analysis differently. And it's gonna force it, whether they want it to or not.
And is that a good thing?
Yes and no. All change, I think, is like that. But yes, I think it can be a very good thing. And then I also worry that it's going to lead to a schism in the field. So we'll just have to see how it works out.
And we have to be there to observe and raise awareness and talk about it, right?
Yep, exactly.
All right, then. So let's look to the future. So that question was a sort of current or past question. So what's the one thing, or you can choose more than one if you want, that you think needs to happen in our field to further advance methodology? So I know you're really interested in, like I am, in the relationship between methods and tools and how important methodology is. So what needs to happen in our field to advance methodology?
I think access is one of the biggest things that needs to happen for QDOS. And I mean, like, my institution they used to have a site license to NVivo, but they don't anymore because people didn't really use it. And it wasn't for students. And, when I was at UGA, we didn't have site licenses for anything. And University of Georgia is huge compared to West Georgia as far as like the focus on research. It's an R1 versus an R3. And I think that access to these platforms and programs and access to training. I mean, it's out there, but in a lot of ways, unless you seek it out, it doesn't happen. And monetarily, it can be a detriment to people. And, you know, I understand that these are businesses and things like that. But if the powers that be at institutions were better aware and trained in the importance of these, and that they were able to work with these companies in a way to facilitate access for students and novice researchers, I think it would dramatically change how we use them, how we understand them, and how we teach them to other people.
Okay, I completely agree. So that's great. What a great way to finish up.
Yeah,
that we agree with each other. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. So many of your stories I knew already, because of course we've known each other for a while, but it was really lovely to hear sort of the extended versions of everything, and to hear about your thoughts about, you know, what you're doing at the moment and what you're thinking about doing in the future. So thank you very much.
yeah. Thank
And
you
I
for
wish you
having
all
me.
the best.
Absolutely. It's always different to be interviewed rather than interview.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thank you.